Okay, and hello, welcome back. With this lecture, we are starting and not finishing talking about one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history, and that is ruler Ivan the Fourth, Ivan Vasilievich, also known as Ivan to most in the West as Ivan the Terrible. Um, Now, many important things, or let me put it this way, much remains a mystery about about who Ivan was, what he thought he was up to, how we should understand him, and what the consequences of his reign were and are. Historians continue to argue about this stuff, and so I will try not to get sucked too completely into the confounding biography of this individual. Um, for one thing, the surviving sources don't allow a proper biography of Ivan the Fourth. Here's some potential images of him in drawings that probably aren't too much of a likeness. The sources don't really allow for a proper biography. Sergei Platonev, one of the greatest historians of this era, wrote that, quote, the main difficulty in studying the reign of the whole period and its central figures are complicated, but that there is little material available for study, um, because the time of troubles and then the Great Fire of Moscow in 1626 destroyed all Muscovite archives and documents to such an extent that one is forced to study the events of the 16th century from fragmentary remains of the original document. A biography of Ivan IV would be impossible because very little is known about him. And one example I think that illustrates how the fact that so little is available to study, there's a tremendous range of what people think is understood about him. On the one hand, you have historians that think he is all but a Renaissance prince of Muscovy and a learned, eloquent, articulate individual, versus on the other end of the spectrum, you had the historian and the distinguished historian of Harvard, Edward Kennan, who wasn't even convinced that Ivan could write. And so there's a lot that isn't known. That said, we will proceed, and I will attempt to convey what we think we can say about Ivan's biography. But at some point, as one historian has written, at some point you just have to stop all the qualifying with maybe, perhaps, could be, because just imagine that every two sentences I say, I'm hedging with something that isn't entirely, well, or that's potentially disputable in the historical record. Um, that said, all right, so some main themes for Ivan's reign, before I kind of delve into Ivan as the person. Under Ivan IV's watch, Russia becomes a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empire. And they will conquer Kazan, who are descendants of the Mongols. They will conquer the people, the descendants of those to whom they previously paid tribute, in sort of a real flip of the hierarchy. And so that's an important move. Moscow becoming a multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empire in the 16th century. Also, the 16th century is the century in which Russia, if it ever re-engages with Europe to the west, it steps out kind of onto the regional stage as a regional power, on its way, here I go being teleological again, to being a real world power in the 18th century. So it's a very consequential century where we start to see both, Russia, that continued consolidation of authority, rise in power, not just in terms of getting its own house in order and having everyone agree that the czar is the czar, and then being a commanding regional authority. And and in addition, in the 16th century, it will start to trade more. Herberstein is the first of many thousands of diplomats and traders and merchants who will come to Russia during the 16th and 17th centuries, and not thousands, but dozens and over 100 of them will end up writing accounts of what they see there. But Herberstein is one of the earliest, one of the earliest signposts in that tradition of travelers coming from Europe and writing about Russia. So Ivan, here is a very iconographic representation of Ivan IV. I'm not really sure what he looked like. Here is a drawing from an actual Muscovite source, a book of rulers. Here is the frontispiece from the Hakluyt collection. And this is an engraving kind of contemporary to Ivan that was made. So maybe this is something of what he looks like. You'll read Jenkinson's account, and Jenkinson describes him as tall, if nothing else. And so we, in these, besides, these engravings, we don't really know what he looked like. And by engraving, that engraving is a type of medium to produce graphs, where, just in case you didn't know, there, unlike usually it's copper plate engraving, wood engravings happen too little, but someone with metal kind of makes a drawing, and then it is run through a printing press. And that's what I mean when I'm saying engraving in these cases. Printing is now afoot since the middle of the 15th century. Russia will actually get its first printing press under Ivan IV, although it doesn't last that long, and it is a slow growing tradition in Russia. So Ivan, his period is often talked about, for better or for worse, in terms of kind of the early period and the later period. The early period is often described as the good Ivan, when he's doing all kinds of productive things, and the bad period as when he seems to be turn into a truly cruel and unhinged tyrant. Now, to that earlier history, Ivan is born in 1530. He is the son of Yelena Glinskaya. And Yelena Glinskaya, by the way, she is descendant of Tatar nobles. So here is an example of someone as high up in the rank as they come, who who has a kind of, in her family tree, Mongol Turkic relations. She's not alone. There's several Russian elites that are like that. We will see it less and less as Russia makes its kind of turns towards the West in a cultural, commercial, diplomatic embrace of those dynamics. So I point out to you that Ivan IV's mother, Yelena Glinskaya, is of Tatar descent. She was the wife of Vasily III, and so when Vasily passed away, Ivan was 3 years old. So the Muscovite princes, the Danilovichy line, they have done a pretty good job of establishing that the firstborn son is going to be the prince, the grand prince. Nonetheless, this is a fraught moment if you have a little baby, because they can't quite rule, and a regency is established. And his mother is the regent, along with an uncle, Mikhail Glinsky, who was rumored to have also been Yelena's lover. I can't tell you what the real story was there, but that is one of the rumors we find in the history books. she ruled with Prince Glinsky, and then as he passed from the picture with a man rumored to be her lover, the Prince Telepnev-Abalinsky. I'm going to just pause for one moment, and because I just read to you this hyphenated name that you don't really need to know at all, Telepnev-Abalinsky. But I wanted to just pause and make a comment on hyphenated names and names in general. First of all, last names are for elites at this period in time. The lowly people, the middling types and lower sorts of people rarely had last names. What you had was you would be the son of your father's name. So if Pyotr, the humble farmer, had a son named Ivan, and that Ivan would be called Ivan Pyotrsin, as in Ivan, the son of Pyotr. This isn't that hard. And by the way, there's a lot of Pyotr's and a lot of Ivans and a lot of Dmitris. And in fact, histories of people that studied names, drawing from the Slavic tradition, there seem to have not been all that many names. I think I might have read one somewhere that 6% of boys were named Dmitri. And so you have an awful lot of Dmitri and Ivan and Pyotr. There's even a saying, "Где плюнешь, там Pyotr." Wherever you spit, you'll find a Pyotr. And one of the reasons that happened is because it was normal tradition to, a child is born, you name that child after the nearest Orthodox saint's day that's coming. In the church calendar, there was days to have the feast of, the Feast of Mary, Feast of Pyotr, Feast of various saints. They were celebrated throughout the year, and it was tradition to name your child near the nearest saint's days. So you'll actually have families where, the parents got busy around the same time every year. The child's born around the same time of year. You have, little Peter and big Peter right in the same family. That happens a bit. I've encountered that several times in documents. So that's a little bit of a word about naming. And you would just have kind of the son of whomever. In the 17th century, names that are maybe related to one's profession, that you're the butcher or the candle maker or the cobbler or the builder, plotnikov or myasnikov. Myasa is meat, plotnikov, carpenter. These sorts of names start to be associated with more lowly types. And we start to see less names emerging. But elites, and this is coming back to this point about hyphenated names, elites always had last names. And elites, that these names are hyphenated, I submit to you, is an indication of the importance of women's families. That among Russian elites, the kind of prestige could also pass through the mothers. It is not, which seems to be an indication that we don't have a system as patriarchal as medieval France, where they passed Salic laws to ensure that women could never hold authority. Here in Muscovy in the early 16th century, we have, granted, there seems to have been some sort of power sharing, but a recognized woman as regent. And the reason that we see hyphenated lines, hyphenated last names, is generally an indication that the woman's line mattered in naming that royal in that elite family. Now, another thing about middle names, or not middle names, but patronymics. If you've read much in Russian literature, you would often have the names seem particularly confusing because it's not just Ivan, but Ivan Vasilovich and Vladimir Borisovich and Pyotr Dmitrovich. Now that Ovich is the suffix of the patronymic, and what it just means is son of. So Pyotr Vladimirovich is the son of Vladimir. Ivan Vasilievich is the son of Vasily. Get it? Pyotr Alexeyevich is the son of Alexei. Ivan, or Alexei Pyotrovich, is the son of Peter. Now, I would like you to just silently try it with your own family. What is your father's name? Okay, you've got your father's name in your head. Now take your name and then add your father's name and add, if you are a male, add Ovich. But if you are a woman, add Avna for daughter. For example, so my example doesn't come so beautifully off the Russian tongue, but my father's name is Thomas. So if I would be Erika Tamasovna. And I've gone to Russian conferences where it is, rather than saying, that is the polite way of address, first name and patronymic, Alexander Borisovich. And they would put on my name tag, Erika Tamasovna. So I want you to think to yourself, and can I actually ask you even to enter into the chat the Russian version of your name. If you were appearing at court in a War and Peace, the novel War and Peace, for example, how would you be addressed? All right, good. I see them coming. So all right, I'll continue, but I just wanted to pause. So hyphenated names have a meaning that indicate elite family, and that the women's line mattered a bit. Naming names was really different for elite classes versus lower classes. And the very low classes didn't even have last names. It was names in the 17th century and then onward start to emerge depending on what your profession is, or sometimes what you do. There's even last names quite uncomplimentary, like not too bright or one-eyed or crooked leg. What we've already met, what Yuri Dolgoruki, of the long arms. So names could derive in different ways. But then the last thing that I'll just say is that this process of Ovich, when it begins, it is reserved for elites. And then as history or as time proceeds, you have lower class people that start to take up the Ovich as well. So that when you get to the 19th century, it isn't just, it is the case that a lowly person might be called, Pyotr Dmitrovich. Whereas in the 16th century, no way. If you're a low class person, you would just be Peter Dmitri's sin, the son of Dmitri, in that way. Kind of think about how Facebook started exclusive and then expanded to allow everyone in. We see a similar, and this happens a lot in kind of exclusivity and building elite culture, that something that starts as a marker of the elites gradually spreads throughout society. That's what happened with Russian patronymics. Okay, so at any rate, there was just a little detour to kind of give a comment on Russian naming systems and a bigger picture. And now we're going to focus back in on our elite czar. So Ivan IV, his dad dies when he's 3. He becomes the czar as a 3-year-old under the regency of his mother, Yelena Glinskaya, who may have been poisoned. There is question marks about her death. And that is actually, as you know, not even the first instance of poison that we encounter in Russian history. I say this as Alexei Navalny's recent poisoning at the hands of Russian government operatives is very much in our own headlines. After Yelena Glinskaya's death in 1538, a group of boyars served as the regent for Ivan for the duration of his minority meaning before he kind of stepped in as an adult himself. When does someone end their minority? Well, there's a little give here, but kind of 16, 17 years old seems to be what it was for him. He ends his minority in 1547. That means in 1547, he was crowned. And interestingly, he was crowned as Tsar. So, and he is the first Russian ruler who will consistently use the title Tsar throughout. As I mentioned earlier, his grandfather, Ivan III, experimented with calling himself in some of his letters to the Holy Roman Empire and some other places. He experimented with calling himself Tsar instead of Grand Prince. He also experimented with some other titles like White Tsar and White from Mongol traditions. But from Ivan the Fourth and his coronation in the beginning of his majority, we start to see the consistent use of the term Tsar. All right, so really quickly, there's a lot of writing on this slide, and I want to kind of walk through some of the things that happened in his early reign. In the accomplishment columns, he started out and he seemed to be quite interested in bringing order to government. And one of the things that he did was he ordered this council concerned with church reforms and sort of solidifying and clarifying rules according to which the church and church high-ranking clerics operated. This council, because, and recall, we essentially live in a theocracy. This isn't a separation of church and state. The czar is appointed by God and oversees the flock. And so it was very much in his jurisdiction to call a council to sort out church, how the church runs itself. This council ends up getting a name it's called the Stogloff Council, and it's called Stogloff because the number sto means 100 in Russian, and glava is a word for a chapter or articles. And so there were sort of 100 articles or moments or chapters, however you want to call it, that this council issued a document, a publication about. And so that is called the Stogloff Council. And it pretty much goes down, a few people, and I confess here, I haven't read all of the Stogloff reforms, but the historian Jack Coleman studied them very closely and is the go-to resource if you want to read more about the Stogloff. His reforming zeal wasn't limited to the church. He also implemented early in his reign other legal reforms, and these included procedures for how judges would operate, such as and the legal system at this point operates very, very differently. If you brought a false accusation, you could get punished. You would be punished for it. Part of the investigative process included torture. How barbaric! It wasn't only Russia, even France into the 17th century also had torture as part of legal procedure. So very different rules. We would look at those rules and see not much at all that we would count as enlightened in them. But in terms of state building, having procedures that there is a way we're going to do this and everyone is going to do this similarly is seen as a kind of step in a more advanced direction for having a state. That authority isn't entirely arbitrary. There's a reference and there's a record and a way to do things. Ivan implemented what is called the gubernia reforms, and this basically had to do with who would be his servitors, how they would collect taxes and give taxes to him. We'll talk more about that, the system of taxing. Taxing is actually hugely important for any government. It's how it gets resources, but also kind of the flip side of taxing, that you remunerate your administration is also a very important step to have good governance, in that it means that your government servitor has a salary. They don't need to fleece the population. They don't need to extort them. So that kind of making those sorts of reforms, which is part of what Ivan is starting to move towards, are important steps in setting up a functioning, sustainable government. One of the things that Ivan does is he creates the musketeers, or the streltsy. He creates the streltsy. Here is a picture of what they might have looked like, carrying their big pike and a early harquebus here, or that's even a later harquebus. The very first harquebuses kind of had to stand on a tripod and be managed by multiple people. But he creates this palace guard known as the streltsy, and it's sort of a palace guard, a proto-standing army. Before, what we've had are the the Grand Prince's Druzhina, that when there's a campaign, they are called up to muster, and then they will go out and fight armies. Now, the musketeers are always standing, always there. And I see here a question from Lonnie. I can take your question.
Yeah, I was just curious if perhaps maybe he modeled the Streltsy off of the Swiss Guard.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that.
I think the Swiss Guards was started in the 1500s, early 1500s. So I don't know. It's just kind of his
Yeah,
grandmother was ward of the Pope. And so he's like, I want my own guard.
yeah. Thinking of yeah. I don't know. I don't know much about the Swiss Guard. I might try and look into it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. But certainly, this isn't the first entity to have a standing guard, but it's the first one that we see and identify in Russian history. Of course, before, even earlier centuries, what you had was boyars who always had their sword at their hilt, kind of surrounding the Grand Prince. Was always there. I mean, there was court, and he was always surrounded by Druzhina and kind of that sort of his loyal men that would protect them in the event that it was necessary, and much time was spent on campaign. But this is sort of a different development, that we're going to choose people not of royal descent themselves, but are just hired to guard the palace. What they may have done as well, they may have had a bit of a broader policing role, and I don't know about that so much, but one thing we do know is that they also served as firemen. In early Muscovite accounts, I talked a little bit about fires. Moscow is mostly a wooden city. Fires are a major danger. And there were really strict regulations about the use of fire, who could distill brewery, who could kind of distill alcohol. And one of the reasons behind that was because you needed to have a constant fire going to have a brewery. So, I mean, that's one of the considerations in some of the broader regulations about fire. I mentioned to you, one of the reasons we know so little about Ivan is because pretty much all of the paper that the state had kept to that point. I mean, the majority probably burned in this fire of 1626. And so the Streltsy, part of their role was firefighters. And I think Olearius writes about how in the event of a fire, they would get out there with their axes, and they would come in and they would start chopping down houses. And you even have people, and they would complain, no, please don't chop my whole house. Maybe the fire will stop. And they would say, no, sorry, we have to create this fire break to stop this fire from going through the whole city. And so that is how, it's not that they're hauling water and hoses out. They are chopping down anything that's in the fire's path if they could. And then Olearius even writes about how people would go out on the frozen river and they would buy back parts of their house and kind of recollect them, or some people would sell them to try and reconstitute your house that got chopped by the Streltsy when it was in the wake of a fire, of an oncoming fire. So the Streltsy, they're this palace guard, but they have a wider community purpose in Russia as well, and they're sent to do all kinds of errands, as we'll talk about when Peter is sorting things out with his half sister Sophia in the 1680s. So that's a change that he makes. Another change is he creates the print yard. He brings a printing press to Moscow and sets up that we're going to print religious texts. We're going to print some military manuals, more religious texts than not. Of course, it's all in the state, and Ivan controls what the Pechatny Dvor produces. And then the final kind of innovation that we see on the watch of Ivan IV is we see the initiation of commercial relations with the English. I'll talk more about that. The Muscovy Company gets established in 1555. The its commercial relations with the English are the reason that Anthony Jenkinson, whom you'll read and we'll talk about next week, goes to Russia in the first place. He also gives charters to the Stroganov family. I'll talk about that as well. Those are both innovations. That's not to say, though, Muscovy has been trading with its neighbors near and far for a very long time, but these are kind of new points. In foreign policy, a lot is going on. He conquers Kazan. That's really important. We'll talk about that. He conquers Astrakhan. Now, this opens the door for the Volga, which we now consider heartland Russia. Wasn't in the 16th century, but it opens the door for Russia to really possess that territory. Of course, it'll take a long time. He does engage in, he engages the Ottomans a bit, pretty much unsuccessfully. And that's in super broad terms, Russia after that isn't going to engage much with the Ottomans until the 18th century, because it's going to be pretty savvy and know that it doesn't want to go toe to toe too much with that big power to the south. The other major foreign policy move that Ivan makes is starting the Livonian War. Russia will be engaged, Muscovy will be engaged in the Livonian War from 1558 to 1583. Ivan starts it, and it starts out going well, but he ends up kind of losing it in the end. It'll go badly at the end, and so it doesn't go down into the success column for him at the end of the day. What he wanted to do was establish a trading toehold on the Baltic. This is going to be an important foreign policy priority for Russia that isn't going to get really solidly realized until the reign of Peter the First, 1701, is when they'll really take the Baltic and hold on to it. Ivan, as part of his foreign policy, also makes overtures to England. He is interested in having alliances against his Livonian rivals and Swedish rivals and a little bit Polish rivals. So he makes overtures to England for that. He wants their weapons. He wants to trade with them more. He proposes marriage to Elizabeth I. And at one point, he even asks, if it came to it, would they grant him asylum? A kind of interesting moment. I'm getting ahead of our story. But to make a long story short, England doesn't really want to anger any of their other neighbors and anyone else on the geopolitical scene by making a strong alliance with Muscovy. And so they pretty much disappoint Ivan in that regard, although they're glad to trade with him. Elizabeth totally gives him the Heisman. The record records 0 response even for his proposal at wedding. How's that for rejection? And similar on the asylum note. And then other, which we'll call foreign policy as well, is Ivan marries a Kabardinian princess. It's not his first wife. It's a second wife, I believe. Maria Timirukina is she comes from the Caucasus Mountains down the Circassians, who are Muslim people, and Muslims north of the kind of Christians that live in what's now Georgia and Armenia. But they have friendly relations with Muscovy, and she converts to Orthodoxy and marries. But many of her brothers and other family members come to Moscow as high-ranking elite courtiers that remain Muslims in the Muscovite court in Moscow. So that's another, I kind of point that out to you. It's another way in which we see Muscovy not as this all Orthodox, all Slavic all the time, but a more multi-ethnic, more multi-confessional entity, even at its most elite court and in the center. And so let's see, where are we? So that's a kind of overview of some of the early accomplishments, and also a kind of really broad strokes overview of his foreign policy. Now, I want to show you this picture as well. This is kind of 4-panel broadsheet that was drawn and printed in 1576. And it's a picture of the Muscovite embassy that went to Regensburg to have an audience with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. And what I use this, what I think this panel shows a number of things. We see in the first panel here, in very finely embroidered caftans, as are long robes, with fine fur hats, boyars, and kind of the high-ranking diplomats that are making the audience. Followed, we see here a picture of also, well-dressed, high-ranking servitors, and they are carrying with them, these are called 40s of sable. So they would collect 40 sable skins, bound them together, make them inside out. So the fur is kind of on the inside. And these were very, you could make a lot of cover a lot of square inches with a 40 of sable. And these were brought as gifts. And so in some ways, this is quite emblematic of the reputation that Muscovy, as it engages with Europe, will develop as a source of furs. It very much was a source of furs. But one thing that I want to point out to you here is that in this third panel, also part of the diplomatic and trading entourage, and that's another kind of point embedded in this picture here as well. Trade and diplomacy were fellow travelers. I think it's a pretty safe assumption when a diplomat is traveling, he himself may be involved at some level in trade, exchange of gifts. There was the exchange of gifts that always happened. There's a bit of a trade component to this. And then there's legitimate explicit trading that happens. The diplomat himself might be involved in trading. And if not, certainly there tended to be people attached to the party who are engaging in trade. Diplomacy and trade are fellow travelers in this time period. And what I want to point out to you about trade here is that some of the goods that they're traveling here are fabrics. And so silks and other fabrics that are coming from the Far East are also part of what Muscovy brings to the West, part of what Muscovy connects to the West. This last panel won't talk about too much, but it's them going to service after they had their audience. This is a very detailed old German that even says, it names names even, and who's who. It's a kind of wonderful source that way. But this general panel, I have right here as we're kind of setting this story of Ivan's reign and what's going on, I want to bring your attention that trade is very much going on. And I'm particularly interested in this part of in what trade was happening and with whom, because it is the subject of my book, where I talk about trade that originates in Siberia. And one of the things that I noticed that I'm sharing with you in that book is that absolutely lots of fur is getting harvested out of Russia. The government is collecting fur tribute from people, and you have all these merchants that are going there to acquire either through trading themselves or actually hunting, trapping, and acquiring furs themselves, furs which they're bringing back and selling and making money off of. But another important component of commercial activity that's going on is that merchants are going farther into Persia, to India, to China, where they are getting other goods, among them textiles, and they are trading those items as well. So we see in here both kind of what we always hear about Russia, furs, and also what we maybe hear a little bit less about are the textiles from the East that are coming through on Ivan's watch. Okay, this is, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide right here. I just put this here, and I can post this as well. That kind of points out how much fighting is happening. What I really want you to know about in terms of wars under Ivan are the conquest of Kazan, the Livonian War. You don't need to know all the ins and outs of it, but know that this long drawn out war happened, and it starts well. Russia starts it. It wants a foothold on the Baltic, and then after many years, it won't end so well. for Ivan at the end, and ends just 1 year before he himself passes away. And it's on Ivan's watch that Russia is going to begin its conquest of Siberia. Of course, even as we've been talking about Russia on the rise, on the rise, on the rise, some other things that happened in this reign. Moscow is sacked by Crimean Tatars in 1571. Damage is huge, and that is an isolated event necessarily. Crimea will conduct major raids against Moscow in a number of years in the 1550s and 1560s. So, and I pause to bring that out because I've been telling you this story about Muscovy on the rise. Muscovy is taking control of its and subordinating its neighbors and really emerging as a powerful country. That's all true enough, but it isn't without pushback and contention for that regional hegemony that it will succeed in establishing. So here, kind of that's sort of kind of thinking about the geopolitical picture of what the territory of the principality probably covered in the 15th century, and then under Ivan III and Vasily, and then with Ivan IV, it will start to branch here into Siberia and only continue eastward. Now, with that, let me hone in here and talk a bit about Kazan. I'll talk about the conquest of Kazan as a step in this expansion that we're seeing happening. Ivan IV captures Kazan in 1552. This is a picture of Kazan, which is kind of located here about where the Volga River turns. So the Volga River, it goes more or less through Moscow, kind of heads eastward, and then it sharply jets south and will go down into the Caspian Sea. And Kazan is almost at that confluence where it turns south. So Kazan is a trading, is a city, much trade happens there. It is a Muslim descendant of the Chagatai horde, the Chinggisid, so it has Chinggisid heritage. It was part of that Central Asian part that fragments earlier, and Moscow never pays tribute to Kazan per se, but they're descendant of these people. And in 1552, after having a long history, actually, it's not like out of nowhere you just had a Russian army show up and conquer this place. Between the remnants of the horde, Muscovite has diplomacy with these places. They're involved even in choosing rulers and kind of supporting certain factions, even within those internal places. There's a real kind of involved Eurasian politics that's been happening here for a long time. But at any rate, Ivan in the 1550s decides that it is now in his interest and within his capabilities to no longer kind of engage in factional, covert and explicit diplomacy with the powers that be in Kazan, but rather just conquer the whole place. And he sends an army which lays siege. The siege is successful, but there will be concrete major resistance that goes on into even 1556. But that said, 1552 is kind of one of the moment where Moscow kind of conquers its former conquerors, its descendants of its former conquerors. And many people place this as the beginning of Russia being an empire. You may be saying, well, they conquered Novgorod that didn't want to be conquered in the 1470s. They used an army then. Isn't that maybe the beginning of empire? And I would say you've got a fair case to be made. The historian Isolde Touré even studies how, the language was a bit different. The saints that they emphasized were a little bit different. So even though we'd say, oh, they're all Slavs and they're all Orthodox, she sees cultural differences there that could serve to support an argument that, Moscow is already behaving as an empire earlier than 1552. I'm pretty sympathetic to that argument as a matter of fact. But then another kind of point in time where we start to say, when does Muscovy become an empire? Certainly, I think with the conquest of Kazan. And if any people, and some people do sometimes say they become an emperor with Peter the Great. No, they've been an empire for a long time by then. But at any rate, the conquest of Kazan is certainly notable in that now it is explicitly it has conquered a people that are different. Now Ivan III, as Ivan III, he had been intervening, and there's this long politics, but this is a real moment and a marker. In August 1552, a very large Muscovy army has 150 cannon, 150,000 soldiers besiege Kazan. As I mentioned in discussion the last time, however, many of the people in this army are actually Tatars, and they're not all kind of an army of Russian nationals by any means. There are Tartars in the Russian ranks that are participating in the siege of Kazan. So when it is said that after Ivan conquered Kazan, that they feasted, pardon, once Ivan conquered Kazan, he feasted for 3 days after the conquest. He distributed 48,000 rubles worth of precious objects to his men. And I point this out because as we talk about reforms and the modernizing type things he did in establishing procedures and good governments, do keep in mind that this is a world in which the rulership is very personal. Loyalty is personal. Instead of people thinking in terms of transparency and rights, people think in terms of largesse, generosity, and mercy. It's a very different dynamic, this pre-modern way of operating. When Ivan returns to Moscow, he has commissioned the Church of the Intercession of the Moat, more popularly known as St. Basil's Cathedral. It's actually several churches all together in this beautiful and not super large, but beautiful architectural achievement that to this day stands at one end of Red Square, right outside the Kremlin in the center of Moscow. Legend has it that Ivan was so pleased with this event that he had the eyes gouged out of the designer architect, main builder, so that he could never reproduce it. I have never found evidence to suggest that that is more than urban legend, but it is a legend that goes around. If anyone can point me to definitive information about it, it's one of these things that gets repeated in every Fyodor's and tour guide books. But I'm not aware of other evidence that it did happen. But St. Basil's Cathedral was built in Moscow to commemorate the conquest of Kazan. So, which is sort of a symbol that there is something very conscious and deliberate about the empire building that's going on. Another thing that happens is this very famous in Russian history and culture icon is commissioned. This icon is commissioned to commemorate the victory over Kazan, and it has a very the name that is "Blessed be the host of the heavenly Tsar," and it's more commonly known as the icon of the church militant. And so what it does is it represents the military defeat that Russia has just accomplished in divine terms, linking it to kind of angels and heavenly saints and divine figures. So historians look to this as important evidence, kind of a clue for how this state conceives of itself and what it's doing, and it puts this military victory in holy terms. And incidentally, it also commissions a history of the Khanate of Kazan, which is the first use of the term golden horde, according to Don Ostrowski. So now with this, between architecture and icons and texts, I'm starting to talk to you about cultural production. And I want to pause on that and say, yes, there's a good deal of cultural production going on. And one of the people behind it is the metropolitan of the church, Macari or Macarius. Now, Macari was the metropolitan of Moscow, and Ivan, he's brought in still during Ivan's minority. He's the metropolitan from 1542 to 1563, and he's been referred to as a nation builder extraordinaire. He was very much behind Ivan's elaborate coronation ceremony. Maybe he had something to do with him being called Tsar right from the first day of his coronation in 1447. And Macarius worked energetically to enhance Muscovy's Orthodox identity. So this icon of the church militant that I showed you, to kind of put their military successes in divine heavenly terms. This happened because God favored this Orthodox people. Macari also organizes missions to go up north to the Finnic Ugric people and convert them. They as yet had not been converted to Orthodoxy. In Moscow, Macari is very involved in literary production. So on his watch, we see texts that record texts like the Great Minyan Reader, Veliki Minye Chetiati, and the Stepnaya Kniga. You don't really need to know what those are about, but the Stepnaya Kniga records the book of genealogy, the royal genealogy, that this is we have a dynasty that's existed through time. It's God favored, and we see the production of icons that link the royal family to the divine, that build the prestige of orthodoxy. And also, one, again, you've all heard the saying, history is written by the victors. He also oversees the production of this massive illuminated chronicle. I'll show you a picture of it. I just wanted to, this is one picture of it on the right. Here's an icon representation of Macarius. And here is one picture from this really long chronicle that Macarius oversees the production of. And it's the page announcing the birth of the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, so a son of Ivan, who won't live very long, but his birth was recorded in this page. And indeed, in Russian history, it was pretty typical in a world that didn't have much in the way of radio broadcast, or no telephone, no television. Communication isn't super easy. When royal children were born, announcements were sent out to governors everywhere, who gave notice to town criers to go out in whatever village and announce the birth of that child and encourage the faithful to pray for the child of the Tsar. It happened for males more consistently than women, is my understanding. Here is a picture of a picture showing more pictures from this illuminated chronicle compilation, which is known as the Litsavoy Svod. And it is this illustrated chronicle with over 17,000 pages, which gives from the beginning of the world, the history of the whole world, Noah's Ark, etc., into Russian history, and then a real detailed accounting of Russian history, including, as I just showed you here, the dates of the birth of royal children. So this is just showing us that on Ivan IV's watch, the paper trail explodes in some measure. That the amount of paper and writing and text that is being generated by this state increases appreciably. And as historians, that is a clue to us that something's going on here in terms of self-conception or whatnot. Again, there's always the issue of fires, and fires have taken out a lot of our sources, but historians feel pretty confident that that it's in the 16th century. Again, printing has come along as a technology, that's part of it, that the state really starts doing more to write a history of itself, record what it's all about, and whether this has to do with its self-conception of itself and what it's up to, or emerging technology that are changing the way things are done. Our areas open for dispute, but this is certainly something we can say, that the record becomes, the written record becomes bigger and more more available for us to study. Here is a page from the Stepnaya Kniga that traces the family lineage from Ivan IV all the way back to a fictive brother of Caesar Augustus. So there's this interest in kind of linking a genealogy to great Roman civilization, which, by the way, well, Caesar Augustus wasn't Christian, but Rome would become Christian. So that's kind of one question too. How did they understand this history, and where did orthodoxy, was it paramount, or was geopolitical greatness also just as important? At any rate, okay, so that's what I kind of introduced Ivan, outlined accomplishments from his early reign, kind of really briefly adumbrated some of what happened in his foreign policy, talked to you about the conquest of Kazan, and then spent some time talking about kind of the court production of a textual tradition overseen largely by Macarius in the middle of the 16th century. I'm going to stop there, and the next time things are going to go a little darker, we're going to talk about the Oprichnina. All right.